Inhuman, all too human, Nietzsche wrote. Error has transformed animals into men. Is truth perhaps capable of changing man back into an animal? Here Nietzsche essentially condenses the Genesis story's original meaning into a single sentence. In Eden, man was an animal, but an error, a mistake, caused him to become man. Is it possible for us to return to Eden? In the Antichrist, Nietzsche wrote, "We no longer trace the origin of the human being in spirit, in divinity. We have placed it back among the animals, and even in asserting that, we assert too much. The human being is, relatively speaking, the most bungled of all the animals, the one most dangerously strayed from its instincts. But for all that, he is of course the most interesting." When you read Genesis in the context of its Near Eastern origin and strip away later interpretations of Adam and Eve being immortal in Eden, then the Genesis story also places the origin of man among the animals. With man's theft of the knowledge of good and evil, he becomes the most bungled and sickliest of all the animals because of his higher consciousness. This higher consciousness makes him the most interesting animal, and makes him in many ways like the gods, capable of creative vision and will, but it also makes him the most dangerously strayed from his instincts. With man's acquisition of higher consciousness comes also the illness of shame and bad conscience. Animals obey their instincts, which are the commands of nature, of life, without hesitation. They are one with the will of life, and when they hear or feel the command of this all-powerful animating force which lives within nature, they are powerless to do anything but obey, and they want nothing else than to obey. They want what nature wants. And what is this vital life force which animates biological life, if not God? Man, however, can disobey his instincts. He can disobey God. Man has a will which is independent from the will of nature. He is able to impose his own values over the will of nature and life which lives inside of him. Unlike the animals, man is self-conscious. He is able to think about what is good or bad for him. He has knowledge of good and evil, and can act according to his own will by overruling the voice of nature within him. This allows man to organize himself into societies and to adhere to moral and cultural laws and customs which might benefit him in the long term, while repressing and overruling his instinctual desires which might cause him to be ostracized from civilization. Unlike the other animals, man has this voice within him called shame or bad conscience, which he uses to regulate his actions, so that he can adhere to the social codes of civilization. All of this causes man to be separated from nature, both without, since civilization causes him to live somewhat separated from the natural world, and within, since his instincts are no longer the primary driver of his will. This is illustrated in Genesis when Adam and Eve are ashamed to show themselves to God, and God covers their nakedness in fig leaves. Their natural nakedness, their animal natures, are covered by the clothes of civilization. Their instincts are concealed by the pretenses, the laws and customs of life in human society. Man's heightened consciousness also causes him to suffer from life in a way in which animals don't, and since he can disobey life, he has a tendency to turn away from life, to hide himself from God, in the language of Genesis. When we understand Genesis through this light, Nietzsche's passage from the Antichrist might almost sound like a commentary on Genesis. The main concern of Nietzsche's philosophy is the domestication of man into a meek, timid creature which lacks any creative power, or for that matter, destructive power. He is afraid that man, once a lion, will become a declawed house cat. Nietzsche writes, "To call the taming of an animal its improvement is in our ears almost a joke. Whoever knows what goes on in menageries is doubtful whether the beasts inside of them are improved. They are weakened. They are made less harmful. They become sickly beasts. It is no different with the tamed human being. Animals have to say yes to life and nature, but man can renounce life and choose death. Man can choose to do what is harmful to life, what restricts life. He can choose not to engage in the war of creation. He can reject the will to power and life which is within him and choose the eternal peace of death. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche wrote, "I call an animal, a species, an individual, corrupt when it loses its instincts, when it chooses, when it prefers what is harmful to it." The reason why Nietzsche rejected the Genesis story of his day can best be illustrated through Rousseau, who Nietzsche often ridiculed. The foundation of Rousseau's philosophy is an historicized version of the Christian interpretation of Genesis. In the state of nature, man was at peace. There was no war or conflict, and there was greatly reduced suffering. However, in civilization, man became corrupted. Life became suffering, exploitation, struggle, and war. In Rousseau's philosophy, you can see the same longing for a paradise of eternal peace which is expressed in Christianity. Naturally, Nietzsche rejected this since he believed that life is war and struggle. However, when you understand Genesis as a description of man's transformation from animal to man, then you could argue that Nietzsche's philosophy actually supports the idea of a return to Eden, or rather aiming for a new Eden, in which man is like he was in Eden but also transformed into something higher and more godlike. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "All beings thus far have created something beyond themselves, and do you want to be the ebb of this great flood and even go back to the beasts rather than overcome man? What is an ape to man? A laughingstock or a painful embarrassment, and man shall be just that to the overman." In order to reverse the domestication of man, Nietzsche prescribed the idea of the reanimalization of man. But this does not mean returning to the beast. For Nietzsche, man is something which must be overcome. For Nietzsche, man is a rope stretched between beast and Superman. But to realize the Superman, we must reclaim the raw, instinctual dynamism which we enjoyed as beasts. Nietzsche contrasted his vision of the last man, the domesticated and denatured man, with that of the Superman, the man who has been made more terrible, more powerful, more fearsome, but therefore also more creative and more good, a man who has not stifled the life force within him or subverted the will of nature, but who has intensified it and made it more powerful and potent. Nietzsche's Superman is also a super beast, a beast man, a man who embraces his instincts and obeys the commands of nature. He thereby says yes to the amoral struggle of creation and does not shrink from life in shame or bad conscience. He dares to embrace nature, within and without, as it truly is, without the clothing of morality and civilization which we use to dress up reality and make it more acceptable to us. This is Nietzsche's vision of a return to Eden and nature, not Rousseau's paradisal nature, but nature as she truly is, terrible, ruthless, and fearsome, but also boundlessly beautiful, creative, and gentle. Nietzsche viewed Rousseau's idealization of nature as an absurd fiction about what nature is really like, and as the unconscious expression of a regressive impulse to shrink away from the violent, creative struggle of life, as an impulse to reject reality for being evil as compared with some imagined paradisal state of peace, which never existed and never could exist. Nietzsche contrasted the Genesis myth with the Prometheus myth, in which man also begins in an animal state, but one which is in no way desirable. Man lives miserably, swarming beneath the earth like ants in dark caves, without sight and without purpose, until Prometheus gives man the power of vision and of light, and teaches man the arts of civilization. While the Genesis myth places emphasis upon the ways in which man is cut off from nature and strayed from his instincts, a phenomena which Nietzsche acknowledges, the Prometheus myth places emphasis upon the creative power which man acquires with his heightened consciousness, a power which is required to create Nietzsche's Superman. Thus we see that neither myth is actually correct. They simply offer different perspectives, both of which are needed for understanding and creating the Superman. If we want to overcome man, we must reconnect with our instincts and with nature. This is why Nietzsche loved the figure of Dionysus, who represents the creative frenzy of nature breaking through the veil of civilization. To avoid our total domestication, we must embrace the vital life force which is inside all of us, as the ancient European pagans sought to do in their rituals and cults. We must disregard anything which makes us weaker, meeker, more tame, more domesticated, more timid, more sterile. We must embrace what makes man hard, barbaric, powerful, for these things elevate our creative powers and allow us to overcome ourselves. From Ted Kaczynski to the Return to Monkey meme, we are beginning to recognize the danger which the denaturing of man in civilization poses. The danger of a civilization which stifles and smothers life. But it is not civilization as such which is the problem. The danger is a civilization which domesticates man, a civilization whose only inheritance is the total destruction of all which is worthwhile in man. Instead of rejecting civilization itself, we should embrace the Promethean vision of civilization, the civilization of the barbarian, of the creator, of the higher man. We are the only self-conscious animal, the only animal aware that we carry the flame of life within us, and the only animal with the ability to stoke and direct that flame, to seize the raw and violent energy of the life force within us, and to direct it towards the creation of superhuman ideals. Once man was an animal, but now our powers are infinitely more abundant than that of any animal. So could we not also overcome man? But we shrink from this task. It is easier to shrink from life than to embrace the war of creation. It is easier to believe that we are the pinnacle of evolution than to strive to overcome ourselves. But my brothers, I bid you, think not of returning to the ape. Think instead of creating the Superman. We are often told to think of the story of Abel and Cain as a moral lesson against resentment. But in focusing on the surface-level meaning of the story, we miss the fundamentally amoral worldview which underpins it. At the core of the story of Abel and Cain is a theory of life, God, and virtue which was intuitive for the ancients, but which frightens the modern listener whose morals have strayed far from nature. Virtue is not doing or saying the correct thing, or the thing which causes the least harm. Virtue stems from having the correct relationship with life and is fundamentally linked with vitality. God does not favor the moral man. God favors the strong. Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the course of time, Cain brought the fruit of the ground as an offering to God, and Abel brought the meat and fat of the firstlings of his flock. And God had respect for Abel and his offering, but he had no respect for Cain and to his offering. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And God said unto Cain, Why are you wroth, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do poorly, sin lies at your door. Cain works as hard as Abel, if not harder, and offers the fruit of the earth, meaning the plants of his crop, as a sacrifice to God. But God rejects Cain's offering, favoring the meat and fat which his younger brother offers. Cain has done nothing wrong, aside from being a farmer, which is even more challenging than being a herdsman. Imagine Cain laboring in the fields, the hot sun on his back, sweat running down his neck. His crops regularly fail or are ridden by disease. His body is weak and malnourished from his diet of vegetables and grain, and deformed from years of back-breaking labor. As he works, he sees his brother in a distant pasture, roaming freely with his flocks. Abel is not bound to the land. He can go wherever he pleases, when he pleases, enjoying the shade of trees and the cool water of streams. Abel is strong and healthy from a rich diet of meat and dairy and long days of walking. And now, on top of this, God scorns Cain and does not accept his offering. Cain's only fault is that he is a farmer. God does not love Abel because he is more moral than Cain. He loves him because he is more successful. God says to Cain, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" But what does doing well mean? It clearly has nothing to do with morality or even religious piety, since Cain provides an offering just the same as Abel. God scorns Cain because he is misfortunate. To do well for Cain would mean to acquire the vitality, blessedness, and freedom which his brother enjoys. Then God would accept and favor him. This logic might seem cruel and unfair to us, but it was universally self-evident among the ancients. They believed that God loves the beautiful, the strong, the successful, the wealthy, the powerful. In fact, for the ancients, being loved by God and favored by God is synonymous with having these things. Additionally, the logic follows that God hates the ugly, the sick, the poor, the weak, and the miserable. The blessed are those loved by God, the misfortunate are those hated by him. In this way, the ancients' conception of God was in alignment with nature and life. It had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with virtue. We can understand the ancient conception of virtue by tracing the etymology of the word. Today, virtue means moral life and conduct, a particular moral excellence, from the Old French vertu, meaning force, strength, vigor, and moral strength. This came from the Latin virtus, meaning moral strength, high character, goodness, manliness, valor, bravery, courage in war, excellence, and worth, which stems originally from the Latin vir, meaning man. Thus we can see that the word virtue is something like a combination of the Latin vir, meaning man, and vis, meaning life. The virtuous man is the man who is filled with virility and vitality, the man who is filled with life, ferocity, manliness, and courage. To have virtue is to engage with life in a manly and bold way, and therefore to be rewarded with vitality, beauty, and strength. This conception of virtue and life came before any conceptions of good and evil in the moral sense. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche illustrates this exact point by studying the etymology of the words for good, bad, and evil in the various Indo-European languages, and showing that the moral conceptions of good and evil are relatively recent developments. The ancients thought in terms of the blessed and the misfortunate, the ruler and the ruled, the victor and the conquered. Achilles was revered and celebrated because he was a powerful, beautiful, and feared warrior. He was like the gods. He was no more moral than the men who he slaughtered on the plains of Troy, but he proved the superiority of his virtue through the right of nature. And while this may sound extremely harsh to us, it is a truer and more honest way of looking at life. Today, we suffer from a separation from the reality of life and from the fundamental workings of nature. Agricultural society, industrial society, and now even digital society has cut us off from nature. We disguise reality with beautiful words and abstract moral concepts in order to make it seem more tolerable and fair to us. But in doing so, we ignore the concrete procedures which actually allow us to succeed in life. The vegan believes that being moral means causing no harm or pain, and therefore abstains from eating meat. This is a totally reasonable and logical way of thinking, but when they follow this abstract moral ideal, they are punished by nature with malnourishment and decreased vitality. In contrast, the meat eater who allows hundreds of animals to be slaughtered each year for his sake is rewarded by nature with strength and vigor because he has the correct relationship with life. Similarly, the activist who devotes their entire life to social justice may end up depressed because of poor lifestyle choices and get hooked on pharmaceuticals, while the gym bro who eats healthy and never gives any thought to social justice is rewarded by life with beauty, health, and success. Again, this is because the Jimbro has a correct relationship with the fundamental principles of life, which allow him to be a winner. In the artificial world which we have created, more than ever we must focus on having the correct, life-affirming procedures in place. Adhere to a clean diet, spend time in nature, craft yourself a beautiful body and a clear mind, purge your environment of physical and psychological toxins, do what makes you powerful, strong, and vital, live your life in alignment with the principles of nature, and life will reward you with beauty, strength, vitality. In the biblical story of Cain and Abel, we have a record of one of the most important conflicts in the history of mankind. The conflict between the agriculturalists and the pastoralists. Perhaps the very same story told in the mythological war between the Titans and the Olympians, the Aesir and the Vanir. Imagine that you are a Neolithic European farmer, laboring in the hot fields outside of your village. Suddenly you hear rumbling like thunder, even though the sky is cloudless from horizon to horizon. You look up and you see something you have never seen. Men riding horses, backlit by the blazing sun. You drop your tools and run for the village walls, but it is too late. You cannot outrun the horses. The Indo-Europeans were a nomadic people who first harnessed the power of the domesticated horse and the chariot to expand out from the Russian steppe, conquering the native farmer populations of Europe, the Middle East, and spreading all the way to India, imposing their gods and caste systems upon the local populations. We know from skeletal remains that the Indo-Europeans were much larger than the native European farmers, and had larger skulls with stronger jaws, likely due to their diets rich in dairy. The agriculturalists had smaller statures and skeletal structures, and were likely vulnerable to disease due to their diets and lifestyle. In all Indo-European religions, there exists the record of a colossal war between two races of gods. In Greek mythology, it is the war between the Titans and the Olympians. In Norse mythology, between the Aesir and the Vanir. And in Hinduism, between the Devas and the Asuras. Some have speculated that this could be a record of the Indo-European conquest of the native farmer populations, whose gods were subsequently overthrown and submitted to the rule of the Indo-European deities. Many have pointed to the fact that the older generation of gods, the Titans and the Vanir, generally seem to represent more chthonic forces, while the Olympians and Aesir are more celestial in nature. However, it's not quite so simple, and it could be argued that it is more likely that the story is much older and traveled with the Indo-Europeans. Either way, as we know from the fact that we are sitting in houses right now, the agricultural way of life would eventually prevail over the nomadic way. As the nomadic Indo-Europeans settled in their conquered lands, they were integrated into agricultural societies and became the ruling castes of the great civilizations of Europe and the Near East. Thus, while their nomadic lifestyle disappeared, the values and religious customs of the Indo-Europeans were preserved in the aristocracies of the ruling castes of these societies. However, the agriculturalists would eventually prevail in this regard too. Nietzsche called this the transvaluation of all values, or the slave revolt in morality, in which the European, pagan, aristocratic ethos was overthrown by the slave religion of Christianity. Nietzsche writes, "The two opposing values, good and bad, good and evil, have fought a dreadful 1,000-year fight in the world. And though, indubitably, the second value has been for a long time in the preponderance, there are not wanting places where the fortune of the fight is still undecisive." It can almost be said that in the meanwhile, the fight reaches a higher and higher level, and that in the meanwhile, it has become more and more intense, and always more and more psychological, so that nowadays there is perhaps no more decisive mark of the higher nature, of the more psychological nature, than to be, in that sense, self-contradictory, and to be actually still a battleground for those two opposites. The symbol of the fight, written in a writing which has remained worthy of pursuit throughout the course of history up to this present time, is called Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. Nietzsche writes this because Christianity, which began among the Jews who were conquered by Rome and was formed as a reaction to Roman power, would eventually conquer Rome and even all of Europe, slowly eating away at the traces of the values and religions of the Indo-Europeans. Nietzsche writes that this reversal of the pagan aristocratic ethos was completed with the French Revolution, which overturned the last vestiges of the Indo-European aristocracy, and that Napoleon was the last chance to return to the aristocratic warrior ethos of the Indo-Europeans. The story of Cain killing Abel on the one hand represents the slave caste of farmers who were conquered by the nomadic peoples, rising up and killing their masters, and on the other hand, the larger conflict between the pastoralist and agricultural lifestyles, in which agricultural civilization eventually won out. For this reason, we can see that it is fitting that the field, the place of agriculture, is where Cain takes Abel to kill him. The way of the nomadic pastoralist dies in the field. In the story of Adam and Eve, being cast out of Eden was representative of the transition from animal to man, and from a hunter-gatherer way of life into a more civilized one. Adam's punishment for eating the forbidden fruit was being bound to the earth in toilsome agricultural labor, and Eve's punishment was being bound to Adam in painful childbirth. But in the story of Abel and Cain, we see that a remnant of the free way of life in Eden, remains, the nomadic, pastoralist lifestyle represented by Abel. Cain has inherited Adam's curse of being bound to the earth, but Abel is free from it, living instead off of his mobile flocks. In the story of Cain and Abel, the victory of the agricultural way of life is represented as a bad thing, almost as a second fall from Eden. In Genesis 4, after Cain kills Abel, God says to Cain, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, so now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth." After killing Abel, Cain becomes an outcast, just as Adam and Eve first became outcasts among God's creations when they acquired higher cognition. Further, Adam's punishment of agricultural labor becoming painful is replicated as the ground is made even harder to till for Cain. Genesis 4 goes on to say that Enoch, Cain's son, created cities, a further estrangement from nature. But since the time of this ancient biblical story, we have created industrial, and now what might even be called digital society, making us even more far removed from Eden. Of course, agricultural, industrial, and digital civilization have lended us great benefits, but they have also come with a great danger. The danger of permanently losing the grace and power of our ancestors, the danger of a never-ending descent into the abyss. The farther we stray from living in alignment with nature and nature's laws, the less free we become, and the less we are favored by the gods. Given the current direction of our civilization, we will all end up being frail, sickly creatures, living in an industrial slum, living the lives of insects. But it is not too late to aim for a different future. It is not too late to correct the course of human civilization and to re-establish a free way of life in alignment with the principles of nature for those who desire it. Though we may not ride horses through the open plains again, we can still aspire to a life on the Olympian heights, a life among the cool, free clouds, a life with eyes set on distant peaks, and when the masses of man all look down and drown themselves in filth and ugliness, is it not all the sweeter to be one of the few who looks up? The interpretation of Genesis which we have received is that of a fall from paradise, in which Adam and Eve enjoyed immortality into a world of death. This mortality also came with the punishments of agricultural and reproductive labor in order to sustain life. We know that the authors of the New Testament took this interpretation, so it was likely the popular interpretation by that time. However, when we look at the original text and strip away the layers of later interpretations, the text does not seem to support the idea that Adam and Eve were immortal in Eden. Even though God said that Adam and Eve would surely die if they ate of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, in Genesis 3:3, the primary punishment for Adam and Eve's disobedience is not death, but rather pain in agricultural and reproductive labor. In Genesis 3:16 to 3:20, God lists out the repercussions of Adam and Eve's theft of knowledge. Unto the woman God said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. And Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all things living. Outside of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve must engage in the cycles of the seasons and of time, preparing food for when the earth becomes infertile and the plants die, and bearing children to carry on when they become infertile and die. We know that agricultural labor existed before Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, since Genesis 2:15 tells us that God put Adam in the garden to, quote, dress and keep it, end quote. And we also know that reproduction existed in the garden, since in the first account of the creation of man, God tells Adam and Eve to, quote, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, end quote. And we also know that marriage existed in Eden, since after the creation of Eve, in Genesis 2:23, Adam says, quote, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man, end quote. And then the narrator gives us an aside, Genesis 2:24, quote, Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh, end quote. Therefore the consequences of the fall are that Eve will experience great sorrow in childbirth. Eve will now be ruled over by Adam, bringing sorrow into their relationship. And Adam will experience great difficulties in agricultural labor until he dies. God's punishments do not explain agriculture, childbirth, or marriage, which are explained by Genesis 2:15, 1:28, and 2:24, but rather the pain and difficulties involved in them. Reproduction, marriage, and agriculture already existed in Eden. The only difference once Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is that pain is introduced into these already established institutions. Adam and Eve's punishments are in alignment with how they were created and what they were created for. The Hebrew Adam means man and is etymologically connected with the Hebrew Adama, meaning red clay, and Dama, meaning earth. Eve in Hebrew is Hawa, which is phonetically similar to Haya, meaning to live. Therefore it is fitting that Adam, who was created out of the earth for the purpose of tending to God's garden, must contend with the earth in toilsome agricultural labor until he returns to the earth in death. And Eve, who was made out of flesh as a helper for Adam, must labor painfully in the creation of new flesh via reproduction. So when we add this context to God's punishments, it seems that when God says, quote, For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return, end quote, it is not a fulfillment of his promise that Adam and Eve would die if they ate of the forbidden tree. Rather, it makes explicit that Adam's punishment suits his creation. This verse is a parallel to the verse, quote, "And thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee," end quote, addressed to Eve, which explains that her punishment comes from her creation as a helper and wife. Adam, the farmer, taken from the earth, labors to create bread and is bound to reunite with the earth, while Eve, the life-giver, taken out of flesh, labors to bring forth children and is bound to reunite with Adam's flesh in procreation. The emphasis in Adam's punishment is that he will labor until he dies. The point is that Adam's connection with the earth is now a source of suffering, and Eve's connection with Adam, with flesh, is now a source of suffering for her. Adam and Eve are not punished with death or immortality for their obedience, just increased suffering. So now that we better understand Adam and Eve's punishments for eating of the fruit of knowledge, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is this fruit? When Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit of knowledge, they become self-conscious and lose the shameless, carefree grace enjoyed by animals in nature. They become acutely aware of their nakedness, their vulnerability, and their mortality. Quote, "And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." End quote. The many parallels between Genesis 3 and the Epic of Gilgamesh reveal the biblical story's likely Near Eastern influence. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu is created by the gods to be the equal of Gilgamesh, the demigod king of Uruk. Enkidu lives at first like a wild man in the woods, running alongside the gazelles, but after he has intercourse with the harlot Shamat, the animals shun him and he must enter human civilization. Ronald A. Vinker's insight in his paper on ancient Near Eastern sexual metaphors is useful here. He writes, "When we first encounter Enkidu, like Adam, he is in the company of beasts, having as yet no knowledge of a woman. Both Adam and Enkidu experience the ascent of knowledge through seduction and sexual knowing. The experience results in wisdom, but it is bought at a great price. Enkidu may no longer enjoy communication with his gazelles, and, as well, the days of Eden's talking serpent are brought to an end. Enkidu and Adam's lives of innocence are lost to the past, and there lies ahead for the both of them a painful and difficult road, as each leaves the simplicity of nature for the ambiguous complexities of human culture." End quote. Vinker believes that eating the fruit in Genesis is primarily a sexual metaphor, and while I don't think this is the case, Vinker's analysis is insightful. One might add that both Adam and Enkidu face not only difficulty and complexity in civilization, but also an elevated awareness of their own mortality, which Adam, Eve, and Enkidu seem to lack among the animals. Later, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu and Gilgamesh have become friends and Enkidu dies, this is why Gilgamesh flees into the wilderness in an attempt to escape the knowledge of his own mortality. In the wilderness, Gilgamesh dresses as an animal, symbolically mirroring Enkidu's existence among the animals. The transition from an animal existence to a civilized one is more explicit in Enkidu's narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh when he leaves the wilderness for Uruk, but is also present in Genesis when God covers Adam and Eve's shameful nakedness with the first makeshift clothing. And if one extends their reading to Genesis 4, the creation of war and cities. This is where we get at the heart of what the knowledge of good and evil really means. In Gerard von Rad's commentary on Genesis, he writes, "So far as the knowledge of good and evil is concerned, one must remember that the Hebrew 'to know' never signifies purely intellectual knowing, but in a much wider sense an experiencing, a becoming acquainted with, even an ability. To know in the ancient world is always to be able as well." He continues, "For the ancients, the good was not just an idea. The good was what had a good effect as a result. In this context, good and evil should be understood more as what is beneficial and salutary on the one hand, and detrimental and damaging on the other." Von Rad is arguing that the knowledge which Adam and Eve acquire in Eden is not a purely moral knowledge, but rather a practical knowledge of the world. In this context, the story takes on a more Promethean appearance. Adam and Eve's disobedience of God has made them independent from him, just as in the Prometheus myth, humanity becoming, quote, intelligent and masters of their minds, end quote, allowed man to gain some power over the gods via the practice of sacrifice. Like mankind, after Prometheus teaches them the arts of civilization, Adam and Eve go from being like animals, shameless in their nakedness and obedient to their master, to having power over themselves and the world around them. In this light, the knowledge of good and evil might better be translated into English as the knowledge of good and bad, or of good and bad things. So now that we have a better understanding of the nature of Adam and Eve's punishments for eating the fruit of knowledge, and of what kind of knowledge the fruit bestows, the question still remains as to why Adam and Eve do not die when they eat the forbidden fruit. When the serpent says, "Ye shall not surely die," he is correct. So we could either take the serpent at his word when he implies that God has made this empty threat out of jealousy or fear, or we can believe that God either took mercy upon Adam and Eve, or fulfilled his promise by sealing off potential access to the tree of life. The serpent tells Eve that eating of the tree of knowledge will make Adam and Eve like gods, saying, quote, "Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." God seems to confirm this notion when he says, quote, "Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever." End quote. God explicitly states that Adam and Eve have become like gods, as the serpent promised, and implies that if they eat of the tree of life and become immortal, they will assume full godhood. One could imagine, as some theologians have, that Adam and Eve had been eating of the tree of life, and that their mortality is somehow intensified or ensured by their lack of access to this tree. This would be consistent with their other punishments, which involve the introduction of pain into an already existent form of labor. However, the simpler explanation seems to be that they had not yet eaten of the tree of life, and that God either overlooked banning them from it, or it only became pertinent to prevent their eating of it once they had acquired knowledge. Either way, the point seems to be that having both knowledge and immortality would make Adam and Eve into gods, which God seeks to prevent. Von Rad takes the interpretation that the key issue of the text is not God's paranoia about Adam and Eve becoming gods, as the serpent implies, but rather the hubris of Adam and Eve's aspiration to godhood. As with mankind in the Prometheus myth, Adam and Eve's acquisition of knowledge gives them an agency more appropriate for divinities than animals. However, one cannot ignore the possibility that the serpent is in part correct about God's jealousy or fear concerning the possibility of Adam and Eve obtaining godhood. There certainly is a mythological precedent for gods displaying anxiety about mortals gaining too much power or usurping the place of the gods. Such anxieties are at the center of the Prometheus myth, especially in Aeschylus's portrayal. But either way, the consequences of Adam and Eve's aspiration to godhood is a separation both from that very godhood and from the animals. While once they wandered the garden naked and experienced relatively little pain in childbirth, like animals, they now must engage in painful labor to stave off their mortality. This is the true meaning of the separation from the tree of life. When man becomes a thinking animal, he is set apart from the other animals and from all other life forms on Earth. Man is no longer subservient to his immediate desires like an animal, to what we call instincts. He no longer obeys the voice of God without hesitation. He no longer obeys what we might call the imperatives of nature. Man leaves nature for civilization. He becomes subservient to customs, to laws, to tradition, which provide him with knowledge of what is good and evil, what is useful and harmful, and which rely largely on social shame to be enacted. This is what it means to be separated from the tree of life, to be an outcast in God's garden. But this separation also presents us new possibilities, new heights to strive for. For while we are separated from the tree of life, our species has the unique ability among the animals to project our mind, our imagination, our will into the future, and to create the future which we envision. Unlike the other animals, our eyes are open. With the power of vision and imagination, we can take control of our destiny and shape ourselves like a sculptor. We can set ourselves lofty goals and overcome ourselves, for we are the only species capable of being artists of the life force. This is what makes us like the gods. Despite the anti-Western and anti-pagan origins of Christianity, Christianity has also preserved one of the key aspects of paganism, the spirit of the Hellenic mystery cults, whose essence was the worship of the seasonal resurrection of biological life. In the medieval image of Christ, we see Dionysus, a god torn to pieces by the Titans and resurrected, whose flesh and blood allowed his followers to partake in his divinity and peer into the deepest secrets of nature. In Christ we see Persephone, the goddess of vegetative life, being reborn from the underworld each season and returning to her mourning mother, bringing with her a miraculous resurrection of life on earth. And in the crucifixion we see the spectacle of the suffering Prometheus, crucified and tortured as a martyr for mankind, blood running from his side where Zeus's eagle tore out his liver. These symbolic resonances began with the authors of the New Testament as inversions of their original pagan meanings, but in the Christ of early medieval Europe, they were portrayed in alignment with the pagan spirit of the Hellenic mystery cults. For the still pagan minds of the first European Christians, Christ was not the logos of reason and rationality, representing a suppression of the carnal, instinctual, and worldly. Instead, the pagan Christ was a symbol of the Heraclitean logos, the fire of creation, the ever-changing, animating force behind biological life. Christ did not represent the static immortality of the desert soul found in other worlds, but rather the eternal, seasonal rebirth of life, the vital essence of biological life contained within nature, conquering death, rot, and decay. The Eleusinian mysteries were a central aspect of Greek religious life. They celebrated Demeter, the goddess of grain, the harvest, and agriculture, and her daughter Persephone, and are attested to, though only opaquely, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. The hymn to Demeter is one of the older and longer of the Homeric hymns, and serves both as an etiological myth about the creation of seasons and the establishment of the Eleusinian mysteries, and as an exploration of grief, death, and godhood. In the hymn to Demeter, Hades abducts Persephone to be his wife, with the consent of her father Zeus, and brings Persephone to the underworld. The loss of her daughter sends Demeter into a state of grief and rage. She makes the earth infertile, threatening to kill humanity. Due to this, Zeus allows Persephone to return to her mother, but since Persephone ate of the fruit of the underworld, she must stay with her husband, Hades, for a third of every year, during which the plants will wilt and die, and the earth will become infertile. The image of the dark-robed Demeter, wandering the earth in sorrow, searching for her daughter who has been taken to the underworld by death, resonates with the image of the mourning Mary in her dark robe, holding the dead Christ. The hymn closes with Demeter teaching her sacred mystery rites to 5 kings, quote, "Sacred things not to be transgressed, asked about or uttered, a great awe of the gods stops the voice," end quote. Because of the vow of secrecy which Eleusinian initiates took, respected here by the narrator of the hymn, we do not know much detail about the mysteries and must rely on myth and archaeological evidence to reconstruct them. On the nature of the mysteries, the narrator says only, "Blessed are earth-bound mortals who have seen these rites, but the initiate, who has no share in them, never has the same lot when dead in misty darkness." Karl Karenyi expands upon the meaning of these sparse lines in his work, Eleusis, Archetypal Image of Mother and Daughter. He writes, The existential emphasis lies on the blessedness. It was achieved through participation in a rite. Thus, an inequality was created between the initiate and the profane, a division here and now, by virtue of which one group is blessed, while the others go to their death in imperfection and uncertainty. The end of existence has taken on two faces. The one shines back on men, lending their existence a special radiance. The other, the end awaiting the vast, uncharacterized multitude, is lusterless. From the mythological, archaeologial, and historical context, we can gather that the Eleusinian mysteries were celebrated with processions, dancing, and the consumption of a grain drink called kaikeon, and that initiates would receive a better lot in death. Caringi writes, "The name Eleusis refers to the underworld in the favorable sense, and may be translated as the place of happy arrival." The grammatical connection between Eleusis and Elysion suggests that the blessedness which Eleusinian initiates received may have been access to Elysion, where heroes go to feast in the afterlife, or at least something similar. However, it is also possible that the initiates received immortality and salvation from death, perhaps through some sort of rebirth. This interpretation would fit thematically with the hymn to Demeter, and may be supported by the close connection between Demeter, Persephone, and Dionysus, who are often pictured and celebrated together. In the Dionysian mysteries, Dionysus, the liberator, offered an alleviation of the burden of mortality and life in civilization through intoxication, dance, and drink. Dionysus is associated with wine, vegetation, fertility, orgiastic sexuality, madness, and theater, all of which involve stepping outside of oneself and being freed from constraints. Dionysus was reborn from Zeus's thigh after being torn to pieces by the Titans, and following on this resurrection, it seems that his initiates were also offered some form of rebirth or immortality. Caringi argues that Dionysus plays a hidden role in the hymn to Demeter, as Persephone was abducted in the Nysan plain, named after Dionysus, and Dionysus and Hades are sometimes conflated in Greek mythology. Though the Dionysian connection is interesting, it will forever remain a mystery what kind of blessedness the Eleusinian initiates were offered in the afterlife. Regardless of speculative reconstruction, Demeter's last words to Persephone in the hymn to Demeter seem to strike at the essence of the mysteries. When the earth sprouts with every kind of fragrant flower in the spring, out of the misty darkness you will rise again, a great marvel for gods and mortal folks. Like Dionysus, Persephone represents the return of life from death and destruction, and in particular, the seasonal rebirth of vegetative life. Though Persephone, much like mortals, is bound through marriage to death, she shows that through death there is also rebirth, just as surely as spring follows winter. In 1 Corinthians, a letter addressed to the Church of Corinth, Paul discusses various disputed theological issues using language reminiscent of the Eleusinian mysteries. One of these issues is a dispute over whether Christians are resurrected after death. Now if it is preached that Christ rose from the dead, how say some among you that there is no resurrection of the dead? Paul then asserts that without resurrection of the dead, faith in Christ is in vain. Later, Paul continues his argument with a rhetorical objection to resurrection. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. In this grain metaphor, the body dies like a seed, but something new is born from it, the resurrected body, which is the wheat. Here one necessarily wonders whether, in his use of grain, Paul might be speaking in conversation with the Eleusinian mysteries and Demeter. Caringi notes this connection in Eleusis, writing, "Nothing about the Eleusinian mysteries was so striking as the initiates' awe of Demeter's gift, the grain and their hope of life after death. In one Christian source, the ear of grain is designated mockingly, but also precisely as the great admired and most perfect epotic mysterion. However, if Paul is in conversation with the Eleusinian mysteries by his use of grain metaphors, it would seem that his use of grain seeks to contrast with the meaning of the mysteries. On the type of eternal life which grain provides in the context of the hymn to Demeter, Carigny writes, "The myth is related to the nourishment men derive from plants. The context can be characterized most suggestively with the help of Greek words. Zoe means not only the life of men and of all living creatures, but also what is eaten. In the Odyssey, the suitors wish to eat up the Zoe of Odysseus. The same meaning attaches to bios, the characteristic life of men. Where men draw their nourishment chiefly from plants, the nutritive plants, not only grain, but the tuberous and fruit-bearing plants as well, are individually perishable, destructive, edible, but taken together, they are the eternal guarantee of human life." At the heart of the mysteries was wonderment at the seasonal rebirth of nutritive, vegetative life out of the earth. Though beneath the earth is the house of death into which the dead are swallowed, this chasm of death births new life each season. In contrast, Paul uses his grain metaphor to point to a spiritual world beyond the impermanent, earthly world of vegetative life. However, Paul's grain metaphor sowed the seed, so to speak, of the Eleusinian interpretation of Christ as the animating force of nature, as the Persephone of the Greek mystery rites. John, following Paul, also writes of immortality, but instead alludes to the Dionysian mysteries. This resonance, which again began as an inversion of pagan ideas, and which would have been implicitly understood by the readers of the New Testament, would later lead the medieval Christ to blossom into a Dionysian figure, a god of nature and ecstasy. In John 6, Jesus speaks of the consumption of his flesh and blood as a path to immortality. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say to you, except you who eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whosoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. Due to John's use of flesh and blood, some scholars, such as Dennis MacDonald, have postulated that the Gospel of John was written in conversation with Euripides' Bacchae, which was popular in the Greek diaspora at the time. The Dionysian mysteries may have involved notions of consuming the flesh and blood of the god, just as the Titans attempted to do before Zeus stopped them. Similarly, John's Christ might be figured as an inverted Prometheus figure who brings the flower of life to man and is crucified for it, but whose crucifixion is an elevation and triumph rather than a punishment. With Jesus' revolutionary claim that the Holy Spirit was available to anyone without being mediated by religious authorities, Christ stole the Holy Spirit from heaven and gave it to man, bestowing upon them a direct connection with God, just as fire and the rite of sacrifice did for mankind in the Prometheus myth. The medieval image of Christ suffering upon the cross as a martyr for mankind recalls the anguished image of Prometheus. The ritualized spectacle of physical suffering was a key component of Greek tragedy, and in Christ this ritual continued on into the Middle Ages. Like the medieval Christian contemplating Jesus on the cross, the viewer of Greek tragedy would feel pity, disgust, and horror at the violent, grotesque, and physically gratuitous suffering of the tragic characters. In Will to Power, Nietzsche wrote, "The tragic man says yes, even to the most excruciating suffering. He is sufficiently strong, rich, and capable of deifying to be able to do this. The Christian denies even the happy lots on earth. He is weak, poor, and disinherited enough to suffer from life in any form. God on the cross is a curse upon life, a signpost directing people to deliver themselves from it. Dionysus, cut into pieces, is a promise of life. It will be forever born anew and rise afresh from destruction. This last line is the key to a vitalist interpretation of Christ in alignment with the Hellenic mystery cults. Life will be forever born again anew and rise afresh from destruction, and moreover, this death and destruction, this suffering, only serves to intensify life, to create something higher, more beautiful, more powerful. In life's war against entropy, life will win.